So I'm delighted to be joined here by Kimberley Chandler to talk about Lucie Rie's buttons. Kimberley is an independent craft historian, specialising in histories and theories of craft. Kimberley, you've been focusing on Lucie Rie's buttons for a few years now, amongst other things. Going back to the 2018 exhibition that York Museums did, focusing on Rie's buttons in particular, for which you wrote a wonderful essay for their catalogue. And for our current exhibition at Kettle's Yard, you've also written a fantastic essay about this extraordinary moment in Rie's career where she's producing ceramic buttons. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about where your research began and how Lucie Rie's buttons fit in.
Great, yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you very much, Eliza, for having me today. And also, of course, to Andrew Nen, the director at Kettle's Yard, and the team that have helped put this on. And also, I'd like to say thank you before I start to the other contributors to the catalogue from whom I'm continue to be learning more about Lucie. So I'd like to start by, I'll share my screen actually at this point. So I'd like to start by describing the context for my research into Lucie's buttons, which was made possible by a research grant awarded to me by Helen Walsh, the curator of ceramics at York Art Gallery. And this research grant afforded me some time to explore Lucie's so-called bread and butter work, making hand and press molded buttons and jewellery for the home and international markets in the late 1930s through to the mid 1950s in London. So this research fed into an exhibition that Eliza has already mentioned at York Art Gallery in 2018, titled Lucie Rie Ceramics and Buttons, which was incredibly well received. So the initial idea had been to focus solely on the buttons, although given Lucie's relative disinterest in them, this raised questions certainly for me about the role of the researcher as a conduit between the past and the contemporary public, and the emphasis given to an artist's sideline production. So while the buttons allowed Lucie to survive the war years and after, and enabled her to experiment with glaze colours, they were never her main preoccupation. Therefore, positioning them within the wider context of her output as a maker seemed both prudent and tactful, and indeed that's the same with the Kettle's Yard exhibition today. So Eliza has asked me to give a brief overview of Lucie's early years button making, so I thought it'd be best to read a couple of opening paragraphs from my essay for Kettle's Yard and merging it with some of my work from York. And then hopefully that will initiate a discussion between ourselves. So Lucie was a potter of extraordinary skill. Her graceful bottle vase forms and bowls and domestic ware, painted with a vivid array of slips and glazes, are widely revered for their sculptural aesthetic. Yet in the first years after her arrival in London in 1938, Lucie, like so many émigré artists at that time, had to start afresh. Although she had received considerable success back in Austria, the upheaval of World War II and the resettlement of many European refugees in Britain was to set her back. And within this new context, which was then a stronghold of revived British slipware and Bernard Leach's Anglo-Oriental ideals, Lucie's urban aesthetic was out of step with the status quo. But rather than wholly submit to Leach's influence, Lucie thought on her feet, and for the next 20 years, she would be involved on and off in making buttons and jewellery, initially in glass and later in ceramic, to meet the needs of couturiers, haberdasheries, and private clients for the home and international markets. And this was a decision that came to shape her biography. So Lucie's remarkable versatility as a button maker in the face of wartime austerity was the product of collaboration, challenging the notion that this modest and reticent studio potter was a lone agent, working tirelessly behind her potter's wheel on individual productions. The buttons provide a material lens through which to reassess Lucie's studio as functioning more like an artisanal workshop. She enlisted the help of several assistants, among them the young German émigré Hans Koper, who was to become her closest associate, to fulfill orders for fellow Austrian Fritz Lampl, a glass artist and founder of Bimini, and without whom the button-making enterprise would never have happened. Lucie demonstrated resourcefulness in her sidestep towards pottery accessories, understanding it as a means to supplement her income while continuing to experiment with her own glazes. The humble button then comes into its own as a metaphor for connection in this period of Lucie's biography, connection to an adoptive country, to a group of like-minded artists and emigres, and to a means of income. So that's just to start things off. I have various other slides here, which perhaps we can refer to as we talk, Eliza, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a sort of context for the button making in this period.
It really does. And you bring out so many aspects of Lucie Rie's button making years that I think really argue a case for them being, you know, so much more than this sidelined part of her practice and this moment in her career that she sort of shut away when she was done with it. She physically sort of put the buttons away in the drawers, didn't really want to think about them again. They were sort of purely practical for her. But as you very beautifully talk about in the York essay and in our Kettle's Yard catalogue, they were this moment in many ways that set her up for the rest of her career, the way that she was working, bringing in assistants, sort of collaborating in her studio, but also the sort of techniques and methods of making that she acquired during those years. But perhaps let's start by sort of talking about, you mentioned that they came out of a moment of necessity. Lucie Rie had arrived in London in 1938 into a country where, despite her relative success early on in Austria, you know, she was unknown. Her style was pretty different to the prevailing taste in studio pottery, but also it was, you know, on the brink of the Second World War, which complicated things even further. So how did the button making begin? It came through her connection to Fritz Lampl. Would you like to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So Lucie and Fritz were friends. They were friends before they came to England. Fritz Lampl was a glass maker, an artist and glass artist. And he had a workshop in Vienna where Lucie had actually exhibited some of her work before. There was a gallery, sorry, attached to the workshop. When they both moved to England at the onset of war, in fact, Fritz came first. He was able to move relatively easily, I think, given his capabilities with glass work. And I think in England at that time, they were keen to sort of increase production of glassware and glass art, if you like. And so Fritz was a particularly attractive figure for that. And then Lucie followed. I think even Fritz helped her with her visa to get over to England. And when she arrived, as you mentioned, she was very little known, or her success didn't mean anything particularly within this new context. And obviously, the sort of trauma of that move and sort of wanting to embed herself in a community of artists like-minded who she could talk with about her experiences as well. And I think Fritz, yes, he gave her that opportunity to come and work with him in his workshop that he'd set up in Soho initially. And it wasn't particularly skilled work either. It was, using dyes to stamp buttons out of glass rods effectively. And so he was able to bring in a whole group of different kinds of artists and craftsmen with different levels of skill, and provide them with a community in which they could prosper and get set up and established in their own ways in London. So it was very much down to this friendship with Fritz, and also his, he was, they were lovers. So there was also this desire to be together, to help each other, and to continue the work of some kind of craft that they had been doing beforehand, before moving over.
And so Bimini, the glass company that Lampel set up, they hadn't been producing buttons prior to this. Was the button making purely a response to the kind of circumstances of wartime austerity that kind of afforded them this opportunity to branch out into button making?
Absolutely, yeah. The buttons. In fact, I can show you the kind of work that Fritz was doing before. So he's doing this very sort of fine, delicate glass blowing work, much more sort of individual productions, and then the buttons many of them were made, they were direct copies of buttons and cameos within the British Museum. Fritz had some connections there, and the story goes that on a visit to the British Museum, he realised the potential for these sort of very poetic and magical buttons that could be brought from some of the designs in the museum, could be made into buttons that could then be worn by women during the war, and it was a very easy sort of translation, if you like, of designs within the museum into glass buttons that could then accessorize some otherwise rather dour garments under the utility scheme. So certainly, yes, the buttons was an idea that Fritz had on his move to England, and sort of wanting to make something of a very difficult situation.
And so you have this side of the sort of situation, the re-arriving in London, finding herself a kind of supportive community of like-minded people, other emigres. But then there's also the situation she finds herself in, where she can't get a Board of Trade license to make pottery, which is kind of difficult to sort of make head or tail of, because I don't think you need a license these days to make pottery and sell pottery, but clearly she needed some kind of official license to properly establish herself as a potter, and she wasn't granted one, presumably because she was a so-called enemy alien coming from Austria, but also under the kind of austerity restrictions of the Second World War, and what was kind of considered worthwhile. But buttons were an exception to this, weren't they? They were a kind of opportunity to boost the morale of women, and kind of bring excitement to the sort of wartime austerity fashion. So it's this kind of meeting of moments and opportunities that brings Rie to this moment where she's working for Bimini and helping them make their glass buttons. And then at some point she shifts, doesn't she, to making them in ceramic. What's the story behind that? Do you know when that shift happened, and whose idea it was for her to work in ceramic instead?
Yes, I think as far as I know, it was George Schenker, who was the business partner of Fritz Lampel, who first introduced the idea of making pottery buttons. And it happened quite early on, I think. And it's what isn't clear is whether Lucie continued to make buttons in glass as well alongside the pottery buttons. But certainly she moved out of the workshop proper and was doing work from her own workshop in Albion Mews. And I mean, that transition between working with glass and working with ceramic, I think, would have been fairly straightforward for Lucie. And she was still, I mean, she was always encouraged to design her own motifs. Fritz Lampel had a sort of never-ending belief in her ability as a craftsman and a draftsman, and so she was always drawing up designs. There are various sketchbooks and sort of documents in different archives of her working up designs, sometimes alongside Fritz, sometimes by herself. So yes, that transition, I think it would have been fairly seamless, and it just allowed her to work more from her own workshop. And I think it happened around 1942, 1941, something like that. She had been doing other kinds of war work. She was working in an optical lenses factory, polishing lenses, or doing other. She was also worked as a fire watch during the war. So she was doing other things as well. But then she goes into production proper, I think, from her Muse studio around 1941, 1942.
And so she brings production to her studio in Albion Muse, and she's making ceramic buttons. And to kind of get the button factory going requires quite a lot of kind of ingenuity and working out how best to mass produce these buttons. She's a potter that's used to making one-off handmade pieces on a wheel, not kind of mass producing objects. And so I think she actually is advised by Bernard Leach, is that right, to think about press molding her buttons rather than individually forming them.
Yes.
So how does she do that?
So yes, there's a wonderful letter in the Craft Study Centre archive in which Bernard, he makes suggestions about trying to speed up production, because I think initially she wanted to stay with what she knew. So she hand modelled some of them, but then Bernard and others, and particularly Rudolf Neufeld, one of her assistants, he was quite integral to this shift to the press mold. And I think there was a moment where Lucie had gone into hospital for some reason, and Rudolf, one of her assistants who'd been working with her on the buttons at the very early stages, takes over production and starts to introduce these press molds, which obviously speed things up quite dramatically. And then they're molds, I can show you here in the images. They're molds that can make up to 4 buttons in one go. And so despite her kind of initial reluctance, I think when she comes out of hospital, she realizes that he's, got things going in a very sort of good and productive way. And so she continues with the molds, and that's how it works from then on.
And not only does she, take on this idea of press molding, but she also obviously employs assistants to help her, which is another sort of first for Rie, who is has thus far been very much working in a solitary way. So you've mentioned Rudolf Neufeld, but there were quite a few assistants that she employed over the years. There's that wonderful picture of them all standing outside Albion Muse. And many of the assistants that she brought into her studio were like her. They were often Jewish refugees, emigres, coming from Germany and Austria. And actually, on the left-hand side, one of the sort of most significant meetings from this moment is Hans Koper, who arrives at the button workshop in 1946. Is that right? Initially to help with making buttons.
Yes. And he is someone who obviously Lucie is very quickly fond of. I think, is it 1946? Maybe no. I think you're right. 1946. She has around 7 different assistants at various times. Obviously, when this photograph was taken, she had quite a team. And there's Jupp Dernbach there, who was also one of the most sort of he was someone who was very present alongside Hans. And yes, I mean, I think, again, one of the reasons that Lucie enjoyed having her assistants come in and help her was to allow her to then hand over to them and delegate the button making to them, because it's known that she wasn't so fond of it. So it, even though she's here with this sort of team, I think she was very much on the side working away on her wheel while they were taking over the production for her. There's different accounts of sort of life in the workshop under Lucie. Some describe her a very sort of solemn and quiet atmosphere, with little laughter. But I think also, being amongst this community of sort of like-minded artists and with similar histories and similar sort of stories, I think it would have been incredibly reassuring I think, to have been surrounded by so many at a difficult time. So yeah, it's very busy. I've figured out there's a few letters in the archives from Rudolf Neufeld, in which he sort of makes a sort of approximate sum of how much they're making through the buttons. And I think at sort of around 1946, it works out a button is about £3, costs in today's money about £3 to buy a button. And so when they were at their height, Lucie was making around 18,000 a year in sort of from buttons alone, which is quite incredible, really, when you think that she had such a dislike or sort of indifference to them. But possibly, I mean, I've been in conversation as well with Sebastian Blackie, who's a potter and a writer, who has seen the Kettle's Yard show and read the catalogue, and he put to me that perhaps it was you know, that the buttons just represented a very difficult moment for Lucie, a moment of upheaval and an anxiety of the diaspora that was you know, hard to shake off. And she does sort of talk about that in various letters as well. So I think there's this sort of necessity for the buttons, and obviously they keep her afloat and keep the workshop afloat, but this sort of desire to get beyond and start afresh again, if you like. So yeah, it's a very complicated and conflicting story, really.
Yeah, definitely this sense that yes, she sort of wasn't interested in them from a kind of practical perspective, but also they represented this moment of difficulty for her. So you can understand why she sort of wanted to shut them away, out of sight, and sort of forget about that whole moment until, as we'll talk about shortly, this moment sort of many decades later when they're sort of rediscovered and get sort of taken up again. I kind of wanted to just talk about the buttons themselves, because they're extraordinary, kind of jewel-like, playful, beautiful, tactile objects, and we've got a wonderful kind of array of them on display in the exhibition at Kettle's Yard. So most of them are these kind of press molded designs for which she presumably hand modelled the original prototype, from which a plaster cast was made to replicate the design, and then they were all glazed by hand by one of her button assistants, presumably in a sort of what's the word, chain of production. But they also, I love when you see some that have their labels on. She gave them all very sort of charming, imaginative names, which again is quite different compared to the rest of her work, which she never sort of gave titles to. She didn't really talk a great deal about the inspiration behind her work, but with the buttons, they have names like sort of Miranda or Lettuce or Toledo, or presumably that was a sort of, you know, a commercial decision to make them more sellable and to kind of keep track of the different names. But that's something that I love about them. There's this real kind of imaginative, poetic quality to the buttons. I'm also interested in you know, how she worked with fashion designers and with haberdashers, what the kind of arrangement was with them, because presumably she you know, made her very set sort of range of designs and had her set number of glazes, and then would they sort of see a sample book of the designs that she could produce and select from those? Was she working kind of collaboratively with designers on the buttons that she was producing?
I think it was a case of so if you go to somewhere like the V&A, you can see the buttons displayed on these sort of velvet boards. In fact, I think, are they displayed like that at Kettle's Yard as well?
We've got one in the exhibition at Kettle's Yard, which is it's on this sort of velvet backing, and it shows a whole kind of range of different designs and different glazes with little labels on, and it says number 10 in the corner, and I think that was one of her sort of samplers, or
yes. Yes, so she devised this whole system of referencing both the buttons and the glazes, and that's what those sort of numbers and codes refer to. So there are different, different wordings that suggest small or large, or the different, as you say, the different motifs, the different glaze colours. But I think, so the sample boards were very carefully put together. There's evidence in the archives of her and Fritz planning out through drawing some of these sample boards and how they work together. And I'm sure it's a very similar thing now, where you have these colorways for designers in order to see how colors work against each other and on their own. And these sample boards were then taken by a sort of a third party, a seller, from Lucie's studio to haberdashers and to couture houses. I'm not sure about that direct relationship with the designers, in the sense of, you know, discussing. I mean, there are letters in the archive where she's asked to match, for example, some buttons to a certain kind of fabric. Some are much more, they expect a lot from Lucie and give her just a few lines describing a fabric and asking her to produce buttons pretty quickly. And then others, you know, she gets sent sort of little samples of cloth, and then she would match to that. And obviously the longer she was doing it, the more range she would build up. So then there would be less work, if you like, later on, because she would have this sort of sample library, if you like. So yeah, I mean, I think they are quite wonderful, and I'm always amazed at how every time I see them, I seem to encounter a new one as well. But maybe that's just my imagination, but there are so many, and obviously each motif matched with a different glaze brings out a different quality in the button, and then again how they're paired with the different fabrics. So yeah, they're just an extraordinary, and I think that's why they have received so much attention, and I'm sure we'll go on to talking about Izumi-Miyake, is that there is so much potential. When you look at a set of her buttons, there is so much potential that just speaks volumes, and you know, their applications are vast, and you know, they are just like miniature universes, each of them, and the glazes they're not just I mean, some of them are unglazed, in fact, and some of the glazes are fairly sort of matte and straightforward, but others are much more complex, and there are different layers to them, and there's burnishing, of course, with the gold and platinum, I believe she used. So there are all these different levels to them that make them quite a unique and just luscious selection of buttons.
There's a sense of just transforming this very sort of humble material into something precious and beautiful, especially the kind of gold luster buttons that are kind of resembling gilding, but they have this amazing quality. The glazing, I think, is something that's really significant with the buttons, because I think we often talk about, I mean, in the exhibition we talk about the buttons as being this moment of experiment and a real kind of accumulation of knowledge for Rie, because, as you say, she was often handed a swatch of fabric that she needed to match perfectly the glaze color, and for anyone that makes pottery themselves, it's not the same as, you know, mixing a paint until it looks like the right color. You know, an unfired glaze looks a very different color to what comes out of the kiln when it's fired. And so having that knowledge of glaze chemistry and that, you know, that breadth of understanding, to be able to do that and to be able to be that precise and have that broader range of colors and surfaces and finishes was quite extraordinary, and also would have just really set her up for the rest of her career, where, you know, her mastery of glazes is really incredible. Her ability to achieve these different colors and effects. I suppose we can kind of link back to this moment making buttons where she is in essence almost producing little test tiles. Lots of potters make test tiles to test their glazes, and the buttons were almost a version of that. That kind of brings me on actually to sort of thinking about where the buttons fit into the rest of her sort of later career. She obviously stops making the buttons pretty much as soon as she's able to, as soon as she can manage to make a proper living doing what she wants to be doing, which is making pots. And the buttons get put away in a drawer in her studio and sort of not thought about for a little while. But then there's this amazing moment in the early 80s with a meeting with the Japanese fashion designer Issey Miyake, which perhaps you can talk a little bit more about.
Yes, so Issey Miyake, I think, comes over to England and meets with Lucie in I think it's around 1984. And he's absolutely bowled over by her, not just her imagination and her creativity and her incredible skill, but also her as a person. I think he really enjoyed her sort of modesty and quiet ways, but also her very sort of, the fact that she could tell you what she thought very plainly. And he absolutely loved her work. And in fact, ends up putting together an exhibition, which I have here on the slide, Issey Miyake meets Lucie Rie in Tokyo and then in Osaka in 1989. But aside from this, when he first meets Lucie, the story goes that he encountered her buttons in the workshop. She handed him sort of boxes and boxes of these things which she had tucked away, and she other people have said that she would do this on visits to the studio as well. If they admired the buttons, she would often give them away. So she gave us a huge amount of them to Issey Miyake, who could see in them a chance to pair them with his own designs. And he does that in 1989 in his autumn winter ready to wear collection. And here we can see those sort of characteristic Miyake pieces, voluminous, lots of folds of fabric that are sort of pincered together, if you like, with these beautiful buttons of Lucie's. And I think it's interesting as well when we think about the way that these buttons, they were quite heavy things compared to other kinds of buttons being made from ceramic, and certainly some of the larger ones, as you can see here. So they would need to be paired with a fairly substantial fabric in order to sort of not drag on the fabric or pull on the fabric. So I think Issey Miyake uses them to great effect here. And also we have another coat here from Vogue in 1989, and again the buttons just are an extraordinary finish to some of these pieces. So this was the start of a friendship that lasted the rest of her life, and Miyake gave Lucie, so you can see the garment here that she's wearing is the same one that was that formed part of his ready-to-wear collection in 1989. And it's wonderful, this sort of skills exchange, if you like, this gifting of buttons and then a gifting back of a garment for Lucie to wear. And this photo that I found is incredibly sweet. And I think it just, they had an affinity, Lucie and Issey Miyake, not only in their aesthetic taste, but also in their intellectual and creative, imagination, if you like.
It's such a wonderful photo, isn't it? And that whole outfit, the kind of cream wool and trousers, just looks like it's made for Lucie, because she, especially in her later years, wore kind of almost exclusively beautiful white ensembles, and she looks fantastic in it. I think that brings our talk to a close. It's a lovely note to end on, because I think Lucie's buttons are only becoming more and more popular and known about, and particularly that wonderful York exhibition in 2018, which really brought them into the foreground. But visitors to our exhibition as well have been really falling for Lucie's buttons, and we've had button making workshops going on in our learning studio. We've had people producing more than 6,000 buttons for the duration of that project, and they're just something that people can really, you know, latch onto and understand, and they have this wonderful kind of tactile, intimate quality. They're absolutely wonderful.
I do feel that the buttons allow someone who perhaps doesn't know so much about ceramic history or ceramics as a discipline, allow them a way in that's very everyday and very, you know, the small scale nature of them. There's no intimidation there. So I do think the buttons have this wonderful quality, this connective quality that I mentioned earlier, connecting peoples and places and histories and disciplines. So yeah, no, I'm thrilled that I was able to do this research, and I hope to, you know, I hope to continue with it, and as I said before, learning from other scholars of Lucie Rie, because there's still more to learn. I think there's still more to understand about them. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kimberley.